The call came on a Tuesday morning in November. Carter Livingston's number on my screen, 11 digits I hadn't looked at in over a year. I let it ring twice before I picked up. Harper, we have a critical situation. The entire Vanguard cloud matrix is locked. Nobody can authenticate in. It's been trying for 40 minutes and nothing is moving. I already knew. I know, I said. I'm the only one who can open it. Welcome to Payback Office. I tell stories about corporate leverage, patience, and what happens when the people who push you out eventually discover they need you back. This one took 18 months to build. Let's go back to where it started. My name is Harper Dalton, and I've spent most of my career in enterprise infrastructure, the kind of work that doesn't generate applause at company meetings, but generates immediate panic the moment it stops functioning. That gap between who gets the credit and who holds the keys shaped everything about my career. My grandfather ran a cold storage facility in rural Pennsylvania as operations manager. He knew which refrigeration line had been running on borrowed time since the mid-80s, which vendor answered at midnight, where every compressor sat, and what it sounded like when something was about to fail. He told me once that the person who builds the system is never truly replaceable. They can hire someone else, he said. They can't duplicate the knowing. I carried that into every room I worked in. When I joined Vanguard Systems 8 years before this happened, I was 31, with a master's in systems engineering and a solid resume. What didn't show on paper was the capacity to understand a system whole, to build it with my fingerprints threaded through every layer, so quietly that nobody thought to ask whose hands had assembled it. For 8 years, that was my competitive advantage. Then Carter Livingston was promoted to VP of Technology Infrastructure, and he decided everything I had built was an inconvenience to his vision. Vanguard Systems was a mid-sized enterprise technology firm, north of $2 billion in revenue, compliance-heavy, with clients including financial institutions, regional hospital networks, and federal contractors. Downtime was a contractual liability, measured in hundreds of thousands of dollars per hour. Vanguard's infrastructure was a patchwork. 8 years of acquisitions and vendor decisions made by committees that never coordinated. I spent my first 2 years mapping every dependency, every single point of failure, every access pathway. I made myself the person who held the complete picture. By year 3, I began restructuring. I proposed a unified root-level cloud management system that would consolidate access control across Vanguard's infrastructure into a single credential matrix. The CTO, Philip Okafor, approved it without ceremony. I built it over 11 months. Every access credential, every recovery pathway, every root-level key. The system was registered under my professional ID because I had built it from the foundation up, and nobody else had asked to be embedded in the architecture. My ID was the origin node. That decision, made without agenda, would become the entire story. By year 6, I filed a provisional patent on a core authentication protocol I had developed internally. It covered a specific method of layered credential cloud access verification that I had designed from scratch. Philip encouraged the filing. We both understood that if the methodology became an industry standard, IP ownership would matter. That patent application was still pending the day Carter arrived. Carter came in as VP of Technology Infrastructure 6 years into my tenure, recruited from a larger firm where he'd overseen a major platform migration. He arrived carrying confidence earned somewhere else and immediately applied it to a place he hadn't taken time to understand. Within 60 days, he was restructuring the technology organization, installing new team leads imported from his previous company. I sat across from him in a one-on-one during his 3rd month. "Walk me through the infrastructure architecture," he said. I spent 30 minutes doing exactly that, every layer, every dependency clean and precise. He nodded through most of it. Then, "How many people understand all of this at a system-wide level besides you?" "Right now, just me." "That's a liability, Harper. Single points of knowledge are just single points of failure with better PR. We need to redistribute this across the team." "I'd be glad to document everything and run training. I've been requesting that resource allocation for 2 years. We'll get you what you need." The resources never materialized. What arrived instead, 8 weeks later, was a directive to transition key infrastructure documentation to Garrett Holt, someone Carter had brought from his previous firm. I could see the shape of what was forming. The patent proceeding continued quietly through Vanguard's legal department. I was waiting on the formal internal endorsement required before the application could advance to full filing. In month 4 of Carter's tenure, I received an email from Vanguard's legal coordinator. The VP of Technology Infrastructure had reviewed the patent application and determined that the underlying methodology did not constitute a novel invention, a standard implementation of existing architecture principles. He had declined to endorse. No meeting, no conversation. A coordinator's email. I requested a formal review. That request sat untouched for 3 weeks before a meeting was scheduled. The meeting was held in Vanguard's largest conference room, the one with glass walls overlooking the open floor plan, where 40 or 50 people had a clear line of sight. Carter had invited his entire leadership team. 6 people I barely recognized, plus Garrett Holt and 2 legal staff members. I arrived prepared for a technical discussion. What I walked into was not that. Carter stood at the head of the table with a printed slide deck. The cover page read, Infrastructure Methodology Review, IP Assessment. We've completed an internal technical assessment of the authentication protocol Ms. Dalton submitted for patent consideration. The assessment concluded that the methodology is a derivative application of existing standards. There is no novel contribution sufficient to protect. The assessment is wrong, I said. The layering method I developed is distinct in how it handles root-level credential recovery under live authentication load. That specific application has not been patented. Carter looked at me. Harper, with respect, every systems architect believes their work is novel. But believing it and demonstrating it to a patent examiner are 2 entirely different thresholds. I'm not describing a belief. I'm describing the technical architecture. And Garrett's team reviewed that architecture and concluded it doesn't meet the bar. The company is withdrawing its support for the application. I think we're done here. The room had watched the entire exchange. I had presented a precise technical argument and been dismissed in under 4 minutes, in a glass-walled room visible to half the floor. I gathered my folder, I stood up. I did not say another word. That was the last meeting I attended at Vanguard. I resigned by email that evening. I resigned by email because a verbal resignation would have invited a conversation, and a conversation would have given Carter an opportunity to frame the exit on his terms. The email was clean. 2 weeks' notice, effective immediately, waived at my request. I had built Vanguard's infrastructure from a patchwork into something that held hundreds of millions of dollars in client contracts together. I had watched a man who had been in the building for 4 months dismiss my work as derivative in front of his own people. I wasn't broken, but I was clear. The night I submitted my resignation, I sat at my kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and wrote 3 things down. 1. File the patent independently. 2. Build the firm. 3. Don't touch the matrix. The 2 weeks after I left Vanguard were the flattest I had felt in years. Not dramatic. Just the dull specific weight of having built something real and watched someone else decide it didn't belong to you. If you've ever had that experience where the loss isn't loud, it just sits, you know what that stretch felt like. If you're in something like it now, stay with this story. The next part took time. It always does. Hit subscribe. The rest of this story is worth staying for. The patent question was first because it was most time sensitive. When Vanguard declined to co-endorse the application, the IP claim reverted cleanly to me as sole inventor. This is a documented pathway most employees never explore, because they assume their employer's refusal closes the door. Doesn't. I had been careful when I first developed the authentication protocol. I had done significant portions of the foundational design work outside Vanguard systems on my own equipment, nights and weekends, before integrating it into the company's infrastructure. My IP counsel confirmed the independent filing was defensible. I retained patent attorney Elliot Marsh, who specialized in enterprise technology IP. We spent 6 weeks rebuilding the technical documentation from scratch. I paid for it out of savings I'd been building for 3 years. The application was submitted independently in month 2 of my departure. It would take 14 months to receive preliminary approval, but it was moving and it was mine. I incorporated as Dalton Infrastructure Group, a single-person LLC operating out of a co-working space in downtown Philadelphia. My first 2 clients were companies I had developed vendor relationships with at Vanguard. When I left, they called to ask where I had landed. When I explained what I was building, 2 asked whether I would consult on ongoing infrastructure projects. One was a regional financial compliance firm struggling with an authentication framework migration. The other was a mid-market healthcare network that needed a credential access system, redesigned to meet updated federal standards. Both needed someone who could build a credential matrix that wouldn't fail under live authentication load. The specific problem I had already solved, the specific thing Carter's team had called derivative. I took both engagements. I delivered clean work on compressed timelines. By month 5, I had a third client. By month 7, I had brought on junior systems architect Petra Wills. By month 9, we had a pipeline and a reputation. The firm was not a revenge strategy. It was simply what I would have built eventually. Carter just accelerated the timeline by making the alternative untenable. The third item, don't touch the matrix, was the most consequential decision. When I built Vanguard's root-level cloud management system, the credential architecture was anchored to my professional authentication ID. This was not a policy violation. It was how the system had been designed when I was the sole architect. My ID was the build ID. The system initialized on my authentication and cascaded outward from there. Standard practice upon an architect's departure would have been a formal credential transfer, reassigning the origin node to a designated corporate service account. This requires active cooperation from the departing architect, a documented handoff, and a root-level credential audit. None of that happened when I left. Carter's team managed my departure quickly, administratively, at the surface level. My access to Vanguard's day-to-day systems was revoked within 48 hours. Email, VPN credentials, internal platform logins all terminated. But the root-level cloud matrix sat 3 layers below the operational interface. Garrett's team had taken over management of the infrastructure I built, but they were managing the operational layer, the surface. Nobody had gone root deep to audit the credential origin. My professional authentication ID was still the foundation the entire system was running on. I knew this the day I left. I considered raising it. What I concluded was this. I had resigned, I had been dismissed, my professional obligation was complete. If their infrastructure team had conducted a proper credential audit, they would have found it immediately. That they hadn't was an operational failure on their side. I did not revoke the credentials. I did not transfer them. I simply left the matrix exactly as it was. And then I waited to see how long it would take them to notice. 8 months into building Dalton Infrastructure Group, I ran into Paige Kellner at an industry networking event. Paige was a technology sector recruiter, sharp, well-connected. She had reached out twice after my Vanguard departure with placement opportunities that felt like lateral moves dressed in upward language. I had declined both. When she spotted me at the event, she got straight to it. "Harper, how's the independent thing going?" "Well, 3 active clients, a 4th in conversation. We're growing." "Good." I ask because I've had 2 director-level roles that would have been very strong fits for your background. Infrastructure lead at scale. I appreciate that. I'm not interested. Not right now. She studied me. "Can I be honest with you? Please." Walking away from Vanguard the way you did, without a leadership role lined up, going independent in a market that consolidates, it reads as reactive to some people. The window for stepping back into a director's seat at a company with real scale is not infinite. You know that. I know. And you're still not interested. Not right now. She accepted that, but as we parted she said, "Whatever you're building, Harper, I hope it's worth what you're passing up." "It will be," I said. She didn't know what I knew. She didn't know about the matrix. She didn't know that the independent patent application was 6 months from preliminary approval. She didn't know that I had already developed a secondary authentication recovery protocol through Dalton Infrastructure Group, a proprietary system designed specifically for enterprise clients whose credential architecture had been built by a departing architect and never properly audited. Because Vanguard was not the only company in the world sitting on that specific problem. They were simply the most familiar one. And while I was designing the recovery framework for clients who needed it urgently, I was also designing the exact tool that would eventually be the only functional solution to a disaster nobody at Vanguard had yet realized was forming beneath their infrastructure. Over the 18 months following my departure, Dalton Infrastructure Group developed and filed proprietary documentation for what I internally called a Root Credential Recovery Framework, an RCRF. The concept was straightforward in principle and difficult to execute, a structured methodology for identifying, auditing, and transferring root-level authentication credentials in enterprise cloud environments where the original architect had departed under unplanned conditions. In plain language, a system for fixing exactly the kind of invisible time bomb that Vanguard's infrastructure team was sitting on without knowing it. The framework was built in 5 documented phases. Phase 1 root credential audit. Phase 2 dependency map. Phase 3 transfer protocol. Phase 4 verification layer. Phase 5 audit trail. Elliot Marsh helped me protect the framework. We filed a separate IP application covering the RCRF methodology, a clean standalone filing. By month 14, I had 2 independent IP filings in process, a consulting firm with 6 active clients, and a proprietary recovery framework that precisely addressed the most dangerous unresolved vulnerability in enterprise cloud infrastructure. The vulnerability Vanguard had created for itself the day their infrastructure team failed to conduct a root credential audit when I walked out. I was not watching Vanguard obsessively. I was building. The firm took the majority of my attention. But the technology sector in Philadelphia is not large. People talk. What came back to me over those months was a picture I assembled slowly without seeking it out. Carter had restructured the infrastructure team significantly. Garrett had been given expanded authority. There had been at least 2 client-facing incidents requiring emergency vendor support. Carter had publicly attributed both to legacy architecture dependencies, blaming the systems I built without naming me. He had also begun describing Vanguard's infrastructure modernization as a strategic initiative to move away from single architect dependency models. He said this at industry panels. The irony that he was describing a problem he created by mismanaging my departure was not lost on anyone paying attention. I read the article once. I set it down and went back to work. 14 months after I left, my patent attorney sent me a preliminary approval notice on the original authentication protocol filing. The protocol that Carter had called derivative in a glass-walled conference room now had a federal examiner's preliminary finding that it was, in fact, novel and patentable. I had it framed, a small frame sitting on the bookshelf behind my desk where I can see it, but visitors would have to look for it. The satisfaction of being correct doesn't require an audience. And through all of it, the root-level cloud matrix at Vanguard Systems remained exactly as I had left it. My professional authentication ID origin node, running the whole thing from 3 layers below the surface. Garrett's team managed the operational layer every day without touching the foundation. 2 infrastructure incidents had been resolved without anyone going root deep. Carter had restructured, modernized, and rebranded the entire organization without conducting a single audit of the credential architecture holding it together. The time bomb was still ticking. I had not placed it there. I had simply built a system correctly and departed without the proper offboarding that would have disarmed it. What would happen when its surface was not something I had engineered? It was something I had simply not prevented. And I had built with complete precision, the only tool that could fix it quickly when the moment arrived. That is not revenge. That is preparation meeting inevitability. 14 months after I left, I received a phone call from former colleague Weston Fry. Weston had been a mid-level infrastructure analyst at Vanguard before Carter's restructuring pushed him toward the exit. He had landed at a smaller firm in New Jersey, and we stayed in loose professional contact. The call lasted 11 minutes. Most of it was catching up. Then near the end, almost as an aside, I heard something through a former Vanguard contact that I thought you might find interesting. Apparently Garrett's team has been dealing with some kind of recurring authentication anomaly in the cloud environment. Not client-facing internal, but it's been happening long enough that people are starting to ask questions. I kept my voice even. What kind of anomaly? Access resolution delays. Certain administrative functions are intermittently returning authentication errors that don't match any of the user credentials involved. Like the system is reaching for something that isn't where they think it is. I already knew exactly what the system was reaching for. Huh, I said. I figured you'd find that interesting. Ido. Thanks for the call. I hung up and sat with the information. Not with satisfaction. With recognition. The way you feel when an equation you wrote years ago finally produces the output you always knew it would. The matrix was starting to show its foundation. Let me explain the technical reality of what Garrett's team was experiencing. The root-level cloud matrix I built was a living credential architecture, one that regularly performed internal authentication cycles, resolving system-level access queries against the origin node to confirm credential chain integrity. These cycles happen automatically in the background. Standard practice. The difference in Vanguard's system was that those cycles resolved against my professional ID, not a corporate service account, my personal professional authentication ID, which was no longer associated with any active Vanguard system account, but which remained structurally embedded in the matrix as the origin node. For 14 months, the system had been quietly performing those cycles and returning what appeared to be successful resolution, because the credential record still existed in the matrix's deep architecture, even though the account it referenced was no longer active. It was like a building's alarm system calling a disconnected phone number. For a while, the call goes unanswered and the system logs it as an acceptable timeout. Eventually the timeouts accumulate, the error threshold is crossed, and the system begins behaving erratically. That threshold had been crossed sometime before Weston's call. The authentication anomalies Garrett's team were seeing were surface symptoms of a root-level credential conflict that had been building for over a year. And nobody on Garrett's team could identify the source because identifying it required a root-level credential audit, the exact audit that should have been conducted when I departed. They were looking in the operational layer. The problem was 3 layers below them. I had built the only structured methodology in the industry for finding and fixing exactly this kind of problem. 3 weeks after Weston's call, Adrian Cole from Hartwell Advisory, a compliance consulting firm we partnered with, called with what she framed as a hypothetical question. Hypothetically, if a mid-sized enterprise technology firm were experiencing recurring authentication failures that their internal team had been unable to resolve over 4 to 6 weeks, and those failures were creating compliance documentation gaps for federal contract clients, what would your assessment of the urgency level be? The urgency level would be high. Federal contracting compliance timelines don't accommodate extended infrastructure anomalies. You're looking at potential contract review triggers within 60 to 90 days. And if the firm's internal team had been unable to identify the root cause despite multiple diagnostic cycles, then the root cause is below where they're looking. The diagnostic approach needs to change, not the diagnostic effort. A pause. Would Dalton Infrastructure Group have capacity to take on that kind of engagement? We would need to assess the specific architecture first. But yes, structurally, that's exactly the kind of problem we're built to solve. I'll be in touch. She did not name the client. She didn't need to. Only one company in my professional orbit fit every variable. A mid-sized enterprise technology firm, federal contracting clients, authentication failures in a cloud environment, an internal team unable to find the root cause despite weeks of effort. I knew whose infrastructure was failing. I knew why. I knew that the only methodology capable of resolving it quickly enough to protect their federal contract relationships was sitting inside Dalton Infrastructure Group's proprietary documentation. I also knew that the person responsible was going to have to make a decision about whether his pride was worth more than his company's federal contracts. I did not call Adrian back. I let the situation breathe. What happened next came to me secondhand. 3 weeks after Adrian's call, Carter held a closed-door meeting with Garrett and 2 members of Vanguard's executive leadership, the COO and General Counsel. The meeting addressed the authentication anomalies, which had escalated from an internal nuisance to a documented compliance concern. One of Vanguard's federal contracting clients had submitted a formal inquiry about the authentication delays. The person staffing the assistance station outside had previously worked with me for 3 years. She called me 2 days later. The meeting had started controlled and ended visibly tense. Carter had presented Garrett's latest diagnostic summary, 4 weeks of investigation that had identified surface symptoms, but failed to locate the origin of the credential conflict. The COO asked how long the investigation had been ongoing. Garrett answered honestly, 6 weeks total. The General Counsel asked, is this a security incident or an architecture failure? Garrett answered, architecture failure. There's no indication of external intrusion. The system appears to be resolving against a credential reference that is either outdated or misregistered, at a level below our current diagnostic access. Carter. Then we need deeper diagnostic access. Whatever layer this is sitting on, we need to reach it. Garrett, the challenge is that reaching the root level architecture requires origin credential authentication. We've been working under the assumption that the corporate service accounts hold that access. They don't appear to. We're trying to determine what credential actually initializes the system at origin level. The COO. Are you telling me we don't know who holds root access to our own cloud environment? We're working to confirm that, Garrett said. Carter said nothing for a long moment. Keep working. I want an answer by end of week. The meeting ended shortly after. End of week came and went. Garrett's team did not have an answer, because the answer was not in any layer their diagnostic tools could reach. The answer was threaded through a credential origin that only one person fully understood. And that person was building a consulting firm in downtown Philadelphia, sitting on a proprietary recovery framework, waiting for a specific phone number to appear on her screen. I don't know exactly when Carter's team finally identified my professional ID as the origin node. I know it happened in the third week of the crisis window, after the federal client inquiry, and before the contract review trigger Adrian had described. What I know is what the discovery would have looked like. A root-level credential audit finally performed, finally reaching the foundation. A scan of the origin authentication record. A professional ID attached to a name that had not been an active Vanguard employee for over a year. My name. I know what that discovery would have required Carter to reconcile. That the infrastructure he had restructured, the platform Garrett's team had been managing, the cloud environment holding his federal client relationships together, all of it initialized on the credentials of the woman he had dismissed as derivative in a glass-walled conference room. That his own departure management had left a live origin credential embedded 3 layers below an infrastructure he believed he had taken over completely. And I know what the discovery made obvious. Resolving the crisis required either my cooperation or an independent rebuild of the entire matrix from the ground up. A process that would take months, cost millions, and almost certainly trigger the federal contract review before completion. The question was never whether Carter would eventually find himself here. The question was only whether he would be willing to make the call. I want to describe the 4 days between when I believe Carter's team identified the credential origin and when my phone rang. I did not spend them anxious. I had been building toward this moment for 18 months, and the building was complete. The RCRF was documented. The patents were in process. The firm had 7 clients and a track record. I spent those 4 days working. Client calls, a proposal for a new healthcare network engagement, a review of Petra's documentation, ordinary work done carefully. I did allow myself one specific thought on the second evening. I sat at my kitchen table and thought about the conference room with the glass walls, about the people who had watched my technical argument get reduced to the word derivative in under 4 minutes. I thought about it as a reference point, a before whose after was now 3 days away. Then I closed the thought and went back to work. On the 4th day, at 8:47 on a Tuesday morning in November, my phone rang. Carter Livingston's number on the screen. I let it ring twice, then I picked up. Harper. Carter's voice was controlled, carefully, deliberately controlled. This is Carter Livingston. Carter, how can I help you? A pause, not long, but long enough to tell me he had not expected me to be that calm. We have a situation at Vanguard that I'd like to discuss with you. Are you available for a call today? I have 30 minutes at 2 o'clock. Another pause. He had called at 8:47 in the morning. The 6-hour gap landed the way I knew it would, because Carter Livingston was not a man accustomed to being told to wait, and both of us knew that this particular morning he had no choice. 2 o'clock works. I'll send a dial-in. I hung up. I sent the dial-in. I went to my 10 o'clock client call and gave it my full attention. Then the proposal review. Then I made coffee and sat at my desk for 7 minutes before 2 o'clock. At exactly 2 o'clock my phone rang again. 4 people on the call. Carter, Garrett Holt, someone from Vanguard's legal team named Philip Adler, and me. The fact that Carter had brought legal told me exactly where his head was. He was hoping the presence of counsel would frame this as a standard vendor negotiation. What it actually was. The VP of Technology Infrastructure calling the woman he had publicly dismissed 14 months earlier, because his infrastructure was failing and she was the only person who could fix it. Harper, thank you for making time. We're dealing with a cloud authentication anomaly. In the course of investigation, we've identified that the root credential architecture has a structural dependency that traces back to your professional authentication ID from your time with us. I said nothing. We'd like to discuss engaging Dalton Infrastructure Group to assist with the credential remediation process. Given your familiarity with the original system architecture, you'd be the logical choice. Walk me through the current state. Authentication anomalies. What's the specific presentation? Garrett answered with precision. The internal cycle failures, the access resolution delays, the root-level credential conflict, the failed diagnostic attempts over 6 weeks. He was an engineer describing an engineering problem which I respected. Has the federal client submitted a formal compliance inquiry? Carter answered. We've received a preliminary inquiry, yes. Preliminary inquiries have a response window. What's your timeline? 42 days to the contract review trigger, Philip Adler said. I wrote it down. 42 days. All right. The credential conflict you're describing is a root-level authentication origin issue. Your internal team has been working the operational layer. The problem is 3 layers below that. You cannot reach it from where you've been looking, which is why 6 weeks of diagnostics haven't produced resolution. The fix requires a structured root credential audit, a dependency map of every system resolving against the origin node, a live-load credential migration to a corporate service account, and a verification layer under simulated authentication load. That is a 5-phase process. We call it root credential recovery. Dalton Infrastructure Group developed and documented the methodology. It's the only structured approach I'm aware of in the market that handles this specific scenario. Silence. How long does the process take? Garrett asked. 18 to 21 working days, with full cooperation from your internal team. That left margin inside the 42-day window. Not comfortable but functional. And the engagement structure? Carter asked. This was the moment the entire call had been building toward. I had known it was coming since 8:47 that morning. Since Adrian's hypothetical question. Since Weston's call. Since I had written "Don't touch the matrix" on a legal pad 14 months earlier. Dalton Infrastructure Group's engagement rate for root credential recovery is $240,000 for the full 5-phase process. That includes the audit, the dependency map, the migration, the verification layer, and the compliance documentation package your federal client will need. Payment is 40% at engagement, 40% at Phase 3 completion, and 20% at final verification. The engagement agreement will also require a formal acknowledgement from Vanguard that the credential architecture being remediated was built and owned by me prior to my departure, which is relevant to the IP context of the methodology we'll be applying. Longer silence. Philip Adler. The IP acknowledgement. Can you clarify what that covers? It covers the fact that the root credential recovery framework is a proprietary methodology developed by Dalton Infrastructure Group and protected under a pending IP filing. It is not a claim against Vanguard's infrastructure ownership. It's standard IP disclosure for proprietary methodology application. Your counsel will recognize the form. Carter had been quiet for almost 2 minutes. When he spoke, his voice had a texture I had not heard before. Not defeated, Carter Livingston would not allow himself to sound defeated on a recorded business call, but compressed, like someone speaking from inside a smaller space than they were accustomed to occupying. Is the rate negotiable? I had expected this question. I had decided months before exactly how I would answer it. No. It reflects the specialization of the methodology and the timeline compression you need. I'm not aware of another firm that can execute this process inside your compliance window. If you'd like time to explore alternatives, I'd suggest moving quickly given the 42 days. The offer to explore alternatives was not a bluff. It was accurate. There were no meaningful alternatives available on that timeline, and everyone on the call understood that. Philip Adler asked 2 more questions about the engagement agreement structure. Garrett asked 1 technical question about Phase 3, and I walked him through it. Carter said almost nothing for the final 12 minutes. At the end, we'll need the engagement agreement by tomorrow morning. You'll have it by end of business today. Thank you, Harper. I recognized in those 3 words the full distance between where this man had stood 14 months ago and where he was standing now. Of course, I said. I ended the call. The engagement agreement was signed 48 hours later. The initial payment cleared 2 days after that. Petra led Phases 1 and 2, the root credential audit and dependency map. I supervised directly. The audit confirmed exactly what I had known. My professional authentication ID as origin node, cascading through 114 system dependencies, touching every client-facing authentication function, and 17 internal administrative systems. The dependency map took 4 days and ran to 63 pages. When Garrett received the dependency map, he was quiet for a long time. He understood what he was looking at. He understood that Vanguard had been managing this complexity without a root-level dependency map, because the person who built it had never been asked to produce one before she left. "This is thorough," he said. "It's accurate." Thorough is just what accurate looks like at this level. Phase 3, the live-load credential migration, took 6 days and 3 overnight sessions. I ran those myself. It worked the way I had designed it to work. Phase 4 was verification under simulated load. Phase 5 was the compliance documentation package. Elliot Marsh reviewed the IP disclosure language. It was clean. We delivered the final package on day 19, inside the 42-day window with 23 days to spare. The federal client accepted the audit trail. The compliance inquiry was closed. Vanguard's cloud matrix was running on a corporate credential for the first time in its existence. And my professional ID, the one that had been threaded through every layer of that system since the day I built it, was cleanly, formally, completely removed. I had finally done the handoff nobody had asked me to do when I left. I had simply charged $240,000 to do it. There is one more detail about the engagement. The compliance documentation package contained, as a standard component of the root credential recovery framework, a formal record of the original credential architecture, who built it, when it was built, and under whose professional ID the origin node had been registered. My name, my credentials, 8 years of documented architecture. This was not punitive. It was a required component. The federal client needed to understand the full chain of custody to accept the remediation as complete. Elliot Marsh had confirmed this months before. The result was that Vanguard's federal contracting client now had a formal document establishing that the infrastructure underpinning their contract relationship had been built by Harper Dalton, that Harper Dalton had departed Vanguard 14 months prior, and that the credential remediation had been performed by Dalton Infrastructure Group at $240,000. The client's compliance officer, from what I was later told, asked Vanguard's account team a single question. Why had the credential transfer not been conducted at the time of the architect's departure? I was not in that meeting. I don't know how Carter answered. I know only that it was asked and that there is no good answer to it, and that the person who had to sit in that meeting and answer it was Carter Livingston. That is what I mean when I say the situation does the work on its own. Dalton Infrastructure Group closed the Vanguard engagement in month 19. By that point we had 8 active clients, 2 pending engagements, and a reputation built one clean delivery at a time. The RCRF became the core of our service offering. Vanguard was not the only organization sitting on an unaudited root credential problem. They were simply the first to experience the consequences at scale. Over the following year, we ran the 5-phase process for 4 additional clients. The independent patent on the original authentication protocol received full approval 8 months after the Vanguard engagement closed. Elliot called me on a Thursday afternoon. I was reviewing Petra's onboarding documentation for our 9th client. I thanked him, finished the review, and then sat quietly for about 10 minutes thinking about a glass-walled conference room and the word derivative. Then I put the thought away. It had served its purpose. As for Carter Livingston, he left Vanguard 8 months after the engagement closed. I heard it through Weston Fry. The departure was described as a mutual decision. In the enterprise technology sector, mutual decision is the professional language for a situation that had become untenable for everyone involved. I don't know where he landed. I have not looked. My office now is a real one, not a co-working desk, not a kitchen table. A real office with windows that face east, a bookshelf behind my desk where a small frame sits in a spot where I can see it, and a team of 4 people who deliver careful, precise work. Petra runs our client delivery operations. Elliot Marsh is on retainer for IP matters. Adrian Cole sends referrals from Hartwell Advisory on a reliable schedule. Some mornings, I sit at my desk and think about my grandfather's cold storage facility in rural Pennsylvania, the refrigeration lines he knew by sound, the vendors who answered at midnight, the owners who understood that without him, the whole operation would seize up inside a week. He spent his career in the gap between who gets the credit and who holds the keys. He never closed that gap. I spent 20 years in this industry learning how to close it. Not loudly, not quickly, just correctly, and with enough patience to let the math finish itself. The equation resolved. That's the whole story. Payback Office, 7,000 of you are here because you understand that the long game is the only game worth playing. If this story landed the way it was meant to, share it with someone who needs to hear it right now. Subscribe if you haven't.